Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this webinar on creating organizational culture that values the role of foster parents in permanency. I'd like to start off by sharing who will be presenting on this webinar today. My name is Kate Hurt, and I'm the Senior Director of Capacity Building and Engagement with Adopt US Kids. Also from Adopt US Kids, we have Alicia Groh with us to talk about organizational change, and Mary Boo, Director of Family Support, to talk about how to support families in this work to achieve permanency. We are also incredibly excited to have a panel of speakers from the Quality Parenting Initiative to discuss the philosophy and real-life experience of being involved in this initiative. We had a little switcheroo of panelists from the original group, but we are equally excited to have these inspiring panelists here today. We have Carol Campbell-Edwards, Training Coordinator with the Youth Law Center, Brandy Hudson, Strategic Initiatives Advisor with QPI, and a former foster youth, as well as a licensed kinship. Manny Arroyo is a biological parent who was involved in QPI and has 3 amazing boys, and Darlene Bell, who has spent her career serving youth and has fostered over 30 youth. We are super excited to hear from them a little later on in the webinar. I'll go over a little housekeeping before we get going. This webinar will be 90 minutes long, and we'll have some time at the end to respond to your questions. We are recording this webinar, and we'll share this recording with you and make it available on our website. Your phone lines will be muted, but please do send us any questions you have using the questions pod. Please also use this functionality if you are having any technical difficulties, and we will assist you with that. And finally, please take a moment at the close of the webinar to evaluate this session. You will receive an email as the webinar closes from Adopt US Kids Evaluation. We greatly value participant feedback, and we use this data to improve our future events. So thank you in advance. To start off, I want to share a bit about Adopt US Kids for those of you who aren't familiar. Adopt US Kids is a national project of the US Children's Bureau. The project is designed to raise public awareness about the need for foster and adoptive families for children in the public child welfare system, as well as assist states, tribes, and territories in their efforts to recruit, engage, develop, and support foster, adoptive, and kinship families. In addition to our national adoption recruitment campaign, our national photo listing website, and our adoption and foster care information exchange system, we also offer free capacity building services. Last but certainly not least, we offer a minority professional leadership development program for current and emerging leaders of color in the adoption field. If you're interested in learning more about our services and programs, please just reach out. Our contact information will be listed at the end of this presentation. So with that, let's get started by talking about the intended goals for this webinar, and then we'll get going with our presenters. We are thrilled to present this webinar today to support child welfare systems in assessing organizational culture and making shifts to ensure the role of foster parents in permanency is valued. The goals for this webinar are to strengthen your understanding of the connection between how staff feel and think about foster parents and the culture of practice that this creates. We will be providing you with strategies to shift or perhaps just strengthen your agency's culture and practice. You will then get to learn about the Quality Parenting Initiative, an approach that embraces foster parents as true partners in reunification. Finally, we will provide you with considerations and strategies to support families in this practice. Now I will hand it off to Alicia Groh, consultant with Adopt US Kids.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And welcome everyone to this webinar. We're really excited to have you join us. As Kate said, I'm Alicia Groh, and I have the privilege of talking today about agency and organizational culture and some ways that we can strengthen that and think about ways to change that culture to keep moving towards our desired behaviors and values in this work. So I'm going to start somewhat higher level in terms of thinking about concepts for organizational culture and agency culture. I'll use those terms interchangeably. And then we'll get more specific about how we can really apply that in our child welfare work, and especially in terms of how we think about roles of foster families in supporting permanency. So I want to get us all kind of on the same page as we talk about what I mean when I'm saying agency culture, organizational culture. And there are a lot of ways to define that. You may have seen various definitions or used various ways of thinking about that in your work. But one way to think about it is that agency culture or an organizational culture is really the overall set of rules, and they're often unwritten rules, that capture the values, beliefs, and expected behaviors of everyone in that organization. Sometimes you hear this referred to as just the way we do things. Some people say that's how we do things here, or they do things differently at that agency. Sometimes that's a softer way or a less specific way of talking about agency culture. And you may have noticed that different organizational cultures show up as you have changed jobs or even been part of different teams or units at the same organization or agency, or noticed differences in organizational culture among different groups that you're part of, different clubs, groups that you may volunteer with, various employers. So it's sort of that untangible, in a way, feeling about what we believe, what the expected activities are, and how we interact with each other. Some common ways that people often notice those differences in agency or organizational culture are in areas such as how time is managed and how deadlines are viewed, maybe more rigidly or more loosely, how hierarchical or flat communications are, and how much that interaction among staff is able to be flat versus hierarchical, how formal or informal people are within an agency, and how humor is or isn't used. That can sometimes show up in real differences that get at different assumptions about the appropriateness of humor in a context, an agency context. So As we're talking about this, I think it's helpful to think about why agency culture matters, and especially as we think about it in the context of child welfare work. And agency culture is incredibly important, and whether we know it or not, that culture really has a lot of impact on our work and on our priorities. One of the biggest ways that agency culture matters is that it really affects the messages that we send, sometimes subtly, to people, both internal and external, about what we value. Our behaviors, our word choices, our forms of communication, and the things that we celebrate send really strong messages about what we think is important. For example, if we celebrate and tell success stories primarily about individual accomplishments, such as, Kate did such an amazing job, she worked really hard, she got this done, let's all applaud Kate, we may be sending messages that we prioritize people working on their own and taking both individual credit and responsibility, rather than prioritizing team efforts and collaborative or shared credit and responsibility. If we start and end meetings at the scheduled times and set and hold people to firm deadlines, that communicates we value more structured time management rather than more flexibility. As you hear me give these examples, you may be reacting to which approach sounds right or wrong, but I want to highlight that I wasn't promoting any of these as better than the others. For those of you who have worked with me, you might have thoughts about my personal preferences on some of those areas I've highlighted, but it might also be that you've worked with me in contexts where I was following the dominant organizational culture, so you saw me following those expectations. That can show some of the power of that organizational culture in shaping behavior. Agency culture is also really important because it serves as an unofficial orientation to staff and to other partners and stakeholders about how we do things here. So a simple example is that a new employee or a volunteer in an office will likely watch to see whether people take lunch breaks and whether they leave their desk or even leave the building, or whether people eat lunch at their desks. That topic of whether you're supposed to leave your desk or not, or leave the building or not for a lunch break, probably isn't covered in official employee handbooks or even in the formal orientation, but people will look for those cues in the people around them to find out what the unwritten rules are. So our agency culture shapes our work in deeper ways beyond just letting us know whether we should go out for lunch. So to get more specific in for our child welfare work, we can think about how agency culture really sends us messages about how we should interact with people and what values we should use to make decisions. If our agency culture involves telling negative stories about various practices or community partners or services, that lets staff know that they aren't really supposed to use those practices or services or engage those community partners. Conversely, if an agency culture involves celebrating specific successes, that can send a strong message about what staff should be trying to achieve. One example that I think is relevant for today's discussion is thinking about whether an agency celebrates adoption finalizations but doesn't celebrate achieving reunification for a child. What messages does that send to staff about various permanency goals and how they're viewed within the agency? You can really think about how that might send some subtle or not so subtle cues about what those priorities are. So now that we've all gotten kind of grounded in thinking about agency culture, organizational culture, and why it matters, I want to get a bit more specific about ways you can think about changing that culture. So an agency's organizational culture is something that really is created over time, and so changing it often takes time too. And one thing I want to highlight is that agency culture or organizational culture is often something that has not been intentionally created and designed. But it may be more of kind of a patchwork and a legacy of various previous leaders, strong personalities and their preferences, special initiatives, grants that took the work in a certain direction, organizational restructuring, and other strategic efforts that may have resulted in a set of organizational culture elements that people are then operating within now. The good news is that changing organizational or agency culture really can be done with an intentional effort. So you can design it, you can be intentional about what you want that culture to be going forward. So I'm going to touch on several ideas today of ways you can think about changing agency culture. Due to our time constraints for this webinar, I don't have time to go into details on all of these, but I am going to cover several ideas, and then we have these on the slides for you, so hopefully you can still have the ideas as reference for your ongoing work. One thing that I want to highlight is that changing agency culture, really, you can come at it in multiple ways. So one approach is kind of a top-down leadership level driven effort where leadership may say, we want to head in this new direction, we want to set new priorities. That can involve giving staff specific directions and guidance on here's what our priority values and beliefs are and will be going forward. Here are the practices we really want to emphasize. And this may involve making policy and program changes within an agency. Another set of approaches for doing culture change can be much more of a grassroots kind of bottom-up approach. And this may involve frontline staff, supervisors, partners, families, identifying really this is where our work needs to be going. This is how we need to be doing things differently. And really being the voice saying this is how we need to move forward in order to be successful and meet our goals. So that can have that kind of bubbling up effect and people highlighting, here's what needs to happen going forward. Here's our vision for how we should do this. And then figuring out how to involve and engage those levels of leadership. As with most change efforts, especially in child welfare, I think what we've seen is that a combined approach and having multiple strategies, both leadership level initiated and grassroots level, is what tends to work best. So just briefly, I want to get you all involved a bit. In your control panel, you have a questions pod. We'd love to have you just add some thoughts about what works in your experience in changing organizational culture, agency culture. So we'll just have you share your thoughts in there. If you can type those out just briefly, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but just to get you thinking about in something you've led or experienced, what have you seen really be effective in helping move forward with changing agency culture? What shifts that? And while you're doing that, I'll keep going, but we can come back to see what you shared with us. I see a couple comments already about building relationships and trust, and culture eats policy for lunch. It's so important. It's a great quote. Yes, that organizational culture, it really does guide the work much more than someone looking at what's in the manual on a day-to-day basis from what I've seen in my work with various agencies and organizations. So thank you for those of you chiming in on this. I see staff buy-in. That's great. Yep. Leading by positive example. This is wonderful that you're highlighting a lot of these great ideas. Seeing things about coaching leadership at a grassroots level. Great comments that you're all sharing. Thank you. So we'll come back and see what else you all have added. But it's great to have you thinking about that in terms of what you see working well. So let's get into a few strategies for changing agency culture because we want to get a little more concrete. One of the things that I see be a really effective tool in a toolkit for thinking about changing agency culture is thinking about the stories that we tell. And I don't mean that in a fictional way, but I mean, most organizations have those stories, whether they're kind of the success stories or the battle stories that people talk about over lunch breaks or they reminisce about at organizational events, or they tell the new staff person, you should have been here back when this thing happened. And so if we think about, we can be intentional about what stories we keep really shining a light on, especially if you're in more of a leadership level, or even if you're in a peer level, what you're wanting to highlight. So if you want to talk about how your week was or how the month has been, think about what is it that you want to really highlight, because the stories that we tell reinforce values and beliefs. And similarly, what we celebrate reinforce those values and beliefs. So to my example earlier, if as an agency or an organization, we celebrate every time there's an adoption finalization, or we post numbers of how many children we've moved to adoption in this month or this quarter, that's fantastic to celebrate that as a permanency outcome. But if we're not also celebrating other permanency outcomes and saying, look how many children we were able to reunify, that's sending a subtle or not so subtle message about what's valued and what's prioritized. So we can think about how do we use that in an intentional way to say, what do we want to celebrate? What stories do we want to tell? Similarly, the images and the language that we use it's another tool you can think about of how do we want to be more intentional about the pictures, the images, and the language that we're using in communicating internally as well as externally. So, for example, if we talk about foster families in terms of beds or calling them providers or contractors, that may fit in terms of how we count things in our data systems or how we think about certain measurements, but it doesn't really capture the idea that they're families, they're partners, they're teammates in this work on behalf of children and families. So that language shift can really help, as part of a broader effort, can help be an intentional tool to use to show what it is that you want to value and what you want that agency culture to be. So as we also think about our values and our priorities, another set of strategies that we can use is really being intentional about how we make our tough decisions and how we explain that reasoning, how we explain how we got to those tough decisions and what we prioritized. So that can be in terms of if there's organizational restructuring that we need to do and leadership is saying we've decided to prioritize practice X over practice Y, or we've decided to keep this contract and not keep this other one. Telling the thinking behind that, being intentional and being transparent about that to the extent that you can within appropriate contracting and HR rules, that really helps people understand the why behind the decisions, and it helps people go, okay, I get it. So we did that because we're aiming at specific goals. These can all be things that really help work together to paint the picture of what our culture is, what our priority is. Another way to think about some of these pieces are to say, if we're not sure we're going to get something exactly right, which side do we want to err on? Do we want to err on the side of listening more to community members or less, or celebrating certain events more or less? And so it doesn't mean that you're getting it exactly right, but it means you're identifying when in doubt, we're going to err on a certain side. Being explicit about that can really help change that culture as well. So here on the screen, we've got several ideas on this slide. This is one where we don't have time to go into all of these details, but I think thinking about a set of strategies that can help you support and reinforce desired behaviors, especially through working with staff. And this is all so much about our work with people. So you can think about how you can infuse your efforts to really craft and implement your agency culture, your desired agency culture, through your hiring and your orientation. So you can be looking at what's that goodness of fit for the culture that you're trying to build. Who are the people who are really going to reinforce the values that you're trying to move towards? And then how can you infuse that in your ongoing training and supervision of staff? Keep coaching on the things you want to support and reinforce in their performance, and highlight things that maybe are contradictory to your desired agency culture. You can also look at options for incorporating things into performance reviews to say, we really want to reward and recognize desired behaviors, and highlight areas of concern if someone isn't supporting the broader agency culture that you're trying to build. Certainly looking at policies, practice models, work tools, those kind of infrastructure pieces are a great way to think about what is it that you need to change or that you have opportunities to change to develop and to reinforce those desired behaviors. Sometimes it's wording changes in forms that you use that can help people think differently about partners you're working with or goals that you're working on. Another thing to think about, and this one I want to highlight a bit more, is the barrier busting and really responding to feedback from staff. So if you're talking with staff about, we want you to move more towards this direction or embrace this agency culture, listen to them and hear if they're saying, I want to do that, but here are the barriers that I'm running into. Sometimes those barriers may be more personal resistance, but often those barriers are things like we haven't set them up with the right tools, enough time to work on things, enough understanding of who they can contact for help. So if you can hear that feedback from staff and look at how you can break down those barriers. Sometimes it's simple things that we can do. Sometimes it's broader changes that are needed. But hearing that so that it really is a feedback loop, and you're not just saying you want the agency culture to move, but you're hearing about what might stand in the way, and you're helping staff solve those problems. And then, as with so much, I think that idea of making corrections when we see behaviors that aren't aligning with our desired culture, that's a key part of giving that helpful feedback and not waiting until an annual performance review, but letting people know, here's how you could shift this, here's a way you could do that in maybe a more family-centered way. So another thing I want to highlight in terms of a set of strategies you can have in your pocket or your toolkit is to think about identifying and engaging champions. And this is important in so much of the work that we do, and certainly in organizational change, is to think about who are the people who are already living this agency culture that we want, even if it's not widespread, who's living the values, who can really be modeling this, and who can help us spread the word in a really authentic way. So people who can tell their success stories about partnering with families, about meaningful collaboration, whatever those cultural values are that you're looking to infuse, who can help spread the word and show other people how that's really helping them be successful in their work. And then, as always, because we recognize the key role that supervisors play, I think it's really powerful to think about how can you not just express a desire for supervisors to help build and reinforce this desired agency culture, but really think about what do we need to do to equip them with what they need. Do they need talking points? Do they need additional assistance or permission to take time for longer supervision sessions to help their staff in really encouraging and reinforcing the desired behaviors? So talk with them about what they would need to be able to reinforce what it is that you're looking to do. You can give them tips for ways to celebrate accomplishments or to tell stories about success of their team members as part of larger discussions. So they're really highlighting that desired practice and recognizing it, and having people's peers recognize that as well. So as we're getting further into this webinar, we're going to get more concrete, which I hope will be exciting and relevant for all of you. So I want to think about, as we think about the idea of changing agency culture in terms of how we view foster parents in our child welfare work. I mean, first I want to recognize that so many of us, so many of you already deeply value foster parents and deeply value the role they play in supporting permanency in multiple ways. And so we're not saying that we're all starting at point zero on this. And I think we're seeing increasingly a desire for many child welfare systems to really view foster parents even more as key parts of the team, supporting children and families and working actively to achieve the permanency goal, whether that's reunification and really shared parenting with birth parents, or if it may be about helping prepare and transition children to adoption or other permanency options. So as we think about the shifting or emerging expectations about the roles that foster parents will play and how involved foster parents will be in sharing their expertise about the children they're parenting, we need to have staff think about what they need from their agency culture to align with and support those shifts. So what do staff need to be able to empower and prepare and support foster parents to be successful in the roles that we're asking them to take on increasingly? So now that I've talked to you quite a bit about broad ideas about agency culture and some ideas for ways to change it, we want to dive into more specific examples. So I will hand this back over to Kate to get us introducing our next section. Kate?
Thanks, Alicia. That was such great information. And so now I would like to introduce Carol Campbell-Edwards, Training Coordinator with the Youth Law Center, to talk about QPI.
Great, thanks so much, Kate. It's really an honor to be here and to share information about the Quality Parenting Initiative. And I'm excited because I'll share for a few minutes, and then we have an amazing panel representing our parents and former youth in care that we are delighted to share today. So just to begin, sharing about QPI and what it's all about, sometimes the question comes up, is QPI a theory? Is it a model? Is it a program? Well, QPI is really an approach to foster care. It's based on the idea that the most important task for the system is to develop and maintain supportive relationships for the child. And that focuses especially on the parenting relationship. It's a philosophy around a network of sites that shares information and ideas about how to improve parenting, as well as how to recruit and retain excellent families. It's also about rebranding. We hear so much about foster parenting and what that means to different people. But QPI focuses on rebranding, not simply with changing a logo or a visual, but it's really changing the expectations of and support for caregivers. It's all about engaging child welfare systems to fully support excellent parenting by putting the needs of children first. There are a few key elements with this QPI approach. There are 3 specific elements. And the first element in this approach is to define the expectation of caregivers. And you do that by listening, by providing opportunities for caregivers to share their voices, by engaging caregivers in decision making, and full and transparent partnership. The second element is clearly communicating expectations to staff, caregivers, and other stakeholders. So in QPI, we talk about developing brand statements. Brand statements identify who you are and what you stand for. These brand statements in QPI really focus on what those expectations are for each other, and they get everyone on the same page. The third element is aligning system policy and practice with those expectations. So having those expectations in place is a critical element, but making sure that system policy and practices are aligned is part of what makes it so successful. When QPI is successful, caregivers truly do have a voice. They work as a team with agency staff to support children and youth. They receive support and training to really work effectively with children and families so that they understand what is expected of them and also what they can expect in return from the system. Based on this information, systems are then able to select and retain enough excellent caregivers to meet the needs of each child for a home and a family. When these changes are accomplished, outcomes for children, youth, and families will definitely improve. So all of those things together really define what the QPI approach is all about. Next, I'd like to just talk about what does excellent parenting look like, because when we talk about QPI, excellent parenting is the value we stand by. It is the foundational belief that every child needs excellent parenting every day. This means that a child in foster care shall be placed with a caregiver who, first of all, has the ability to care for the child, is willing to accept responsibility for providing care, and is willing and able to learn about and be respectful of every part of that child's identity. That includes the child's culture, the child's religion, their race and ethnicity, their special physical or psychological needs, or any circumstances that are really unique to the child, and also those family relationships are so important. Now, in addition, there's a core premise that goes along with this foundational belief that the primary goal of a child welfare system is to really make sure that all children have effective and loving parenting, and that the best way to achieve this is to work with the child's parents to care for them. But when that is not possible, then the system must ensure that the foster or relative families caring for children provide loving, committed, skilled care that the child needs, while of course working with the system to reach the child's long-term goals. So that is really the context of what this means when we say this is what we stand by. And then finally, there are 5 core principles of QPI, of the Quality Parenting Initiative. And these core principles align with that QPI approach that we already talked about. The primary core principle that begins it all is excellent parenting. It is the most important service that we can provide to children and youth in care. We believe that children need families, not beds. The second core principle is that child development and trauma research indicates that children need constant, consistent, effective parenting to grow and reach their full potential. We believe that each community must define excellent parenting for itself. So, although there is an approach to QPI, the nuances of QPI are defined locally. So, each local system must figure out the needs of their caregivers and what their system is prioritizing. The next one is that policy and practice must be changed to align with that definition. And participants in the system are in the best position to recommend and implement that change. So now that leads me to the most exciting part of all, because now we get a chance to hear from the voices. These are the voices that direct, that guide, and inspire the work that we do at the Quality Parenting Initiative. There are 3 panelists that I have the privilege of interviewing. And the first panelist is Manny Arroyo. Manny is a birth parent. Manny is the very proud dad of 3 amazing boys. And it's been exciting talking with Manny since the kids have been home lately. But his boys are ages 13, 11, and 8, and he resides in California. So Manny, I'm going to you first. And the first question I'd like you to respond to is, based on your experiences, how did involvement in the Quality Parenting Initiative affect how you felt about the Child Welfare Agency?
Okay, thank you for having me. Yeah, so it really completely changed my outlook on the agency. It made me realize how important it is for bio parents and resource families or foster parents to get along, and how much trauma they can reduce on your children, and how much better um, the outcome can be when everybody's on the same page.
Thanks so much, Manny. I know that in responding to that question, sometimes we get asked about the involvement of birth parents, and child welfare systems may be hesitant. But as a kind of a follow-up to that first one, what about involvement of bio parents and birth parents? How involved do you think they want to be?
Oh, I 100% involved. As a bio parent, although you made a mistake and you pretty much put yourself in the situation, I think that all bio parents love the children no matter what. What got us to this position, and we always want the best for them. So I mean, we always want to be part of everything possible, and once we feel like we're part of it, I guess we're less um less we calm down a little bit, and we feel more comfortable allowing more people to be part of their life.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for responding to that follow-up question. And then the next question, Manny, is how did the QPI approach affect your relationship with your child?
So the QPI approach, as I like to say, just gave them a bigger family. I think that when you feel that way as a bio parent, that's where QPI really comes in play. Because it's not, I have your kids, you have your kids, and who has the kids now, and who does a better job or who doesn't. At the end of the day, is when kids, they get more support. The family grows. They have more people. They can always go back to foster mom or foster dad, and come back to the parents. And it's the more support, the less trauma. That's how I feel.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Manny, so much. Thank you for being a part of the panel. And now
Thank you
I'll
for
go.
having me.
Oh, absolutely. So now let's go to our next panelist. We have Brandy Hudson. Now, Brandy has a wealth of experience in child welfare, and she's worked with all kinds of different programs, Casey Family programs. She worked for 5 years with the District of Columbia Child and Family Services Agency, serving in all kinds of various capacities. But the main thing that Brandy, she really draws on her own experience as a former foster and probation youth, a child welfare involved parent, and licensed kinship provider. And she really works to elevate and center the voice and expertise of those impacted by child welfare and juvenile justice systems as leaders and designers of systems transformation. So, Brandy, I have the first question for you is thinking about the relationship between foster parents and birth parents. How does a supportive relationship between those parents impact children in care?
Thank you so much, Carol. And I think primarily it helps children feel safer and more comfortable, and it reduces their feelings of divided loyalty. They don't have to try to perform for their foster parent or their birth parent, depending on who they're with. They can really feel comfortable and know that both sets of parents and adults in their life are working together to really center their needs, because everything that we do in child welfare really should be about meeting the needs of young people and children. And I think that when birth and foster parents work together, children just feel that and it comes through. I think that we underestimate sometimes what children hear in their foster homes, or even as they're going to appointments and interacting with the child welfare agency. Sometimes they get subliminal messages about their parents, which then they internalize, and because they come from their parents and that's their family. If we have negative perceptions or we treat their family poorly, then it's a reflection on them. And so they start to wonder if there's also something wrong with them. And they also, feel offended sometimes, when they feel like people aren't necessarily supporting their parents. And so I think that to the extent that everyone who's involved with the child, primarily the birth and foster parents, but even social workers, therapists, everyone who's engaging, really be on the same page and be as positive as possible about their parents and their biological family, and really showing that everyone is on the same page with supporting their parents to be the best possible resources for the child.
Wow, thank you so much, Brandy. I mean, that's a lot that we can unpack in that, but just really stressing the importance of how it impacts children is something that we really want to make sure that we're all keeping in mind. And then as a follow-up question, what do you want child welfare workers to know about the importance of contact between children and their parents while they are in foster care?
So I think it's really important for workers to know that children need to have as much contact with their parents as possible to maintain the relationship and also to feel comfortable. I know that as a young person who experienced foster care, I was constantly worried about and stressed about my biological family. I was wondering, if my parents were doing well, if they were getting the services that they needed, if they were, being supported, and having contact with them and being able to stay in touch and hear about their progress and just know that they're okay went a long way. A lot of the parents who we work with in child welfare have significant challenges around substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence. And so those things really put them at a level of danger that children are aware of. And the more contact that children have with their biological families during their time in foster care, the better off they are, and they're more stable. So they're not necessarily going to have the same behaviors. They're not going to necessarily feel the need to run away way so that they can try to find their family and connect with them and check on them. So I think that if workers really understood that even small things like virtual visits, phone calls, just allowing children to know what's going on with their parents and maintain that contact, it really helps them stabilize in their current placement.
Thank you, Brandy. Thank you so much for just sharing your insight and your experience as a panelist today. And next, I am going to move to our final panelist, Darlene Bell. Darlene is an amazing foster parent. She has spent her career actually serving youth in all kinds of different capacities. Primarily, she's developed all kinds of youth mentoring programs. She is a real community activist. She and her husband, Curtis, are a dynamic duo. He was part of a fatherhood panel for QPI earlier this year. And as it was stated in the very beginning, I just wanted to highlight that as a family, they have been foster parents to over 30 children. They have adopted children. They have opened their heart and their home to children who are in need, whether they are bio family members or not. So, Darlene, we are so delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's get started. So first question, do you think back and before, kind of like as you thought about before the QPI approach and then after you experienced QPI, did you have preconceived notions about birth parents, really thinking before that QPI approach? And how was it different after?
Actually, Carol, no, I did not have any preconceived notions about the birth parents because I come from a background in a family that has been taking in our family members and community members ever since I've been born. And was just always taught to meet people where they are. Every situation is different. So that's how I've pretty much just approach the whole foster care piece. Is you just meet them where they are.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I really respect when you were saying you drew on your own experiences and were a part of a community of natural, givers in that sense, but that real strong sense of community. So let me ask you, in terms of your relationships with birth parents, how do your relationships with birth parents affect children that you are fostering?
Well, knowing for a fact that I haven't personally experienced it, but we've seen it hundreds of times in our family and our community, that losing custody of your child can be extremely painful, a very painful experience. And a lot of the parents, they're experiencing grief, anger, and a multitude of different emotions. So I've always just asked myself, how do I want to be treated? It's kind of like that syndrome of when you point the finger at one person, you have three pointing back at yourself. So, and as a parent of 6 children and a grandparent of 18, it could have been one of my kids. And so when the children come into our home, they come in as strangers, but them and the bio family leave as family. So the relationship pretty much with the birth parent is so important because it reduces the trauma. We're the ones, of course, that see 24/7 all the needs of the child, but to have that relationship with that birth parent or that bio family, it opens the door to all the the unknown needs that the child may have, the comforts, the foods, the likes, the dislikes. So it's extremely important to have that.
Thanks, Darlene. I wanted to just piggyback on something that you said earlier, and that was, around your experience in growing up and how it was a natural process for you. I know that in previous conversations we've heard, where some foster parents are concerned about working closely with birth parents and they're not really sure, they may be hesitant about that. What would you say to those foster parents who have some concerns around it?
I would say to them, like I said from my own self, put yourself in the bio parent's position. But first of all, if you have to come into being a foster parent with shame and blame, this is definitely not something that you want to do. You have to come in it and accept them, for meet them where they are. I think that's the piece. Everything isn't for everybody, but to be a quality parent, we're the bridge, and that's what I'd say to new foster parents. You know, we're the bridge. We're not a lift bridge, but we're the bridge that helps bring the children and the bio family, not just the child, but and the bio family, from tragedy to triumph. You know, and so it's a change mindset.
I love that. I love that. Tragedy to triumph.
Mhm.
Thank you, Darlene. So one final question for you. What suggestions or tips do you have for other child welfare agencies that want to shift how they engage foster parents?
I say one of the key elements, and it's already been said, is not to view the foster families as beds, but we are a key partner. We're the boots on the ground. We're the one that's seeing the tragedies, the nightmares. We're seeing that up close and personal every day, 24/7, that the children are in our home. So for them not to focus on the negative aspects that they may have had with other foster families, don't rely on just emails as their only way of communication. Pick up the phone, have open and clear communication with the foster homes, and then don't set unrealistic expectations for the foster parent. Offer different trainings and supports. You know, the mentor needs to be mentored. You know, the giver needs to receive. So I would say for the agencies to not set unrealistic expectations for the foster parents, and just know that we're a bridge.
Thank you, Darlene. So to Manny, to Brandy, and to Darlene, thank you for sharing your insight and experience, your wisdom with us, and responding to those critical questions that so many participants, I'm sure, have, and providing us with such excellent feedback and information.
Thank you. Carol, I just wanted to say one more thing, and that's to even all the participants on this call, is to know that I think if we look at it in the broader spectrum of everything that's going on, looking at it in a lens of the village is on fire and we need all hands on deck, and needing all hands on deck would just be needing able and stable adults to stand in the gap, be that bridge over troubled waters, like I said, not just for the child, but for the bio family as a whole. And that's it.
Thank you, Darlene. I'm so glad that you said that, because I know we talked about the village and how important that village is. So thank you for emphasizing that.
Thank you.
Okay, and I think now we're handing it back over.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing the philosophy and personal experience of the QPI approach. It's super fascinating to get that real life perspective. So Carol, Brandy, Manny, Darlene, thank you so much for taking the time today to share. And if you have questions for any of the panelists, again, please just submit that in the questions pod, and we'll ask that at the end of the presentation. And so I'd now like to introduce Mary Boo, Director of Family Support at Adopt US Kids, to discuss the critical element of supporting families in this practice of partnership. Mary?
Thank you, Kate, and thank you. It's a tough act to follow, I have to say. Manny, Brandy, and Darlene and Carol, I so appreciate. You'll hear me talk a lot about hearing from people who are most affected, and it makes it a tough act to follow, but again, I really love that we have their voices in here to remind us why this matters, and to remind us that we have to hear from the people most affected by the services that we offer. So I just want to start, I'm going to broaden this a little bit. It's not just going to be just about how to support foster parents, but I want to start by saying we know children fare better when their birth parents, foster parents, and the professionals in their lives are partnered together, working toward the same goal. We also know that children are more likely to successfully reunify when their birth birth families, when their foster families actively partner together and are working on that team together. When we see this in practice, when we see those foster parents who are partnering and supporting birth parents, as Darlene has talked about, and who are so engaged and invested in the success of the birth family, our first thought as part of the members of the system is often, how do we get more of those foster parents? We need more foster parents who get it, who just magically know how to do this. And again, some do because of their life experiences, but many don't. So we really need to challenge ourselves to ask instead, what do foster parents need from us to enable them to partner with birth parents? How can we develop and support them in such a way that they are best positioned to partner with birth parents? How do we create the foster parents that we really want? We know foster parents are critical team members, but we have to be the team backing them up and creating the system, as Alicia talked about, with that organizational culture that supports them and develops them to make it all possible. I want to ask you all a few questions we get throughout this. The first one is, what barriers do foster parents meet when they're trying to partner with birth parents in your system? If you can type that in the question pod, and then I'll read some of them back. But I'd love to know what you've seen as barriers. All right, we're getting a couple here. Safety concerns, fear of the unknown, comfort level with meeting them, miscommunication through third parties, lack of communication, mistrust. And all those things that we're seeing those are barriers that are due to not having birth parents and foster parents work together or to work with the system. Because if you have people working together, they're going to develop that trust. They're going to have those avenues for communication. And so those are some of the things that we'll talk about. And then somebody pointed out, it's usually the own foster parents' fears. And again, those are things that we can address in training, development, and support. And then Leanne mentioned scheduling, and I think that's a key. Logistics are some of those key things that I'm going to talk about just a tiny bit here, but it's an important part of being a foster parent and if you're trying to work with birth parents and other schedules. So thank you so much for presenting those. As we begin to think about changing our system to best support foster parents supporting reunification, we really need to ask ourselves some questions as members, as part of the system. And the first, and we're going to go through a number of questions. The first is, does our recruitment messaging emphasize reunification as a system-wide value and priority? And again, so what does this mean? Do we have our billboards or our outreach, is it talking about parent a child, children need parents, or is it saying you can help a family? You can help a child return home. You can be a partner with us. So thinking about your recruitment messaging, so again, long before we get to supporting foster parents, we have to think about how we're reaching out to them. Are we reaching out to folks who are part of like Habitat for Humanity, people who are here to help their community, or are we reaching out to people who want to be parents? And we may want to do both of those things, but we have to think about what kind of person we're bringing in and what we're asking them to do before they've even come in contact with us. And then similarly, does our early communication convey those same messages? Or do our brochures, our website, our orientation, are they focused on, the first role of foster parents is reunification and supporting children to go back home or to be placed with relatives? Are we including data about the percentage of children who return home or be placed with kin? Those are really important things to be considering so that you're making sure you're not sort of mixing your message and doing a bait and switch for foster parents saying, hey, do you want to be a parent? Oh, but wait, we want you to support this family instead. So think about those messages as you move forward. A next key question is, what skills and attitudes do resource parents need to actively partner with birth parents? And most importantly, how are you helping develop these attitudes? And part of this can be certainly shaped at orientation at training, to let foster parents know that their role is to partner with families to help children return home, and letting them know, as I mentioned, that most children do return home or are placed with relatives. One thing to think about is if you're here to adopt, foster care may not be right for you. We know that it's good for kids if they're able to be adopted by their foster parents so they don't have another move. But if somebody is in it just to adopt, they may not be an effective partner in reunification. So you have to think about their motivations, and can you, through training, change some of those expectations? I know I've seen messaging from some systems that have what are their requirements? The requirements might be you're of a certain age, you have an apartment or a home, and you're committed to partnering with birth families. So it's actually part of their requirements messaging to people. And one of the things that can be, helping people work on attitudes can be greatly affected by including birth parents and young people who've reunified and foster parents who help make that possible. I think, as we just demonstrated so beautifully with the QPI panel, we know that stories are powerful ways to shape and change attitudes and beliefs. So making sure that you have that as part of your development of parents is important. And I think working on those skills and attitudes, one of the things that Brandy mentioned is how negative feelings can be conveyed, negative feelings about birth families can end up being conveyed to the child in their care. And I think that's a really important message to convey to people, that they need to not just not say anything to the child, but even how they are feeling internally can be felt by the child. And having someone who's lived that experience, like Brandy explained it, I think is a great way to consider getting that message across. The next question is, how do we know if we're adequately preparing resource parents to partner with birth parents? And here you gotta gather the data. So are we asking prospective foster parents, both in before and after your training, what their attitudes are about birth families, if they're ready to partner with reunification? You gotta check in on their beliefs. And then you should be surveying birth parents. How did the process go for them? Were the foster parents working with them as a team? Did they feel like part of that partnership? And again, if you're making changes in your system and trying to change your organizational culture, look at that data over time. Is everything getting better? Are you actually increasing reunifications over time? Those are important things to know about whether you're doing this work properly. Next, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, is how are we supporting foster parents through the challenges they will likely encounter? It's fairly easy for me to sit here and say you've got to partner with birth families, but that isn't easy. It can be both hard emotionally and logistically. And you have to think about all the support your system is providing, and if that support is designed to support birth family partnerships, in addition to supporting families as they address the results of trauma and grief and loss and the challenges that the children may be experiencing. I think that the next question to ask is, what feedback loops do we have in place to continue to learn from foster parents about what they need? And we heard Carol say that was a core principle of QPI. I was really glad to see that. It's one of the things we talk about all the time. Are we asking foster parents what support skills they need to succeed? Are we asking them early and asking them over time? Because their needs may change as they become more experienced. And then when foster parents stop fostering, are we asking them what would have kept them in there, or what they could think we could have done better? We have so much to learn from the people who are living this world. And finally, are we equipping our trainers and workers to meet the needs of resource families? Are agency expectations clear? Do staff receive training on how to communicate about birth families and how to counter and reframe negative stereotypes about birth families? We know, unfortunately, those are going to come up in training because of what people have heard and their own maybe limited experience. I think, as one of the several people noted, the fears that people have. Workers and trainers who are working with foster parents need to be able to respond to that and embrace that organizational culture of birth families may have experienced challenges. They may not have been able to meet the child's needs all the time, but that doesn't mean they don't love their kids and aren't interested and can't be successful parents. And I think we talked about earlier, addressing those people who are shaming and blaming, I think is the way Carol or Darlene put it, is we need to have workers who are able to do that. Oops, sorry, I went backwards. So those are some of the questions to consider. And let's talk more specifically about the development. And by development, we mean often the training, the prospective parent training or ongoing training that foster parents need. And the items that are listed on this slide and on the next slide are some of the few that we think are most important for you to include in your training and development plans for foster parents. And communication skills, conflict management skills, coaching skills. So becoming a parent coach can be critically important skill for foster parents. Cultural competence, can't emphasize that one enough. and understanding how to talk with children and youth about their birth families. We certainly know about the importance of letting people, the impact of trauma on children, but also on parents, and the intergenerational trauma that has affected families is a critically important thing for foster parents to understand. And they need to understand about grief and loss, both for themselves, but also for children and for their birth parents. All members of the partnership are experiencing grief and loss, and it has impacts on their behaviors and decisions. And those are critically important things for them to know about. So if your training for prospective parents doesn't incorporate all the items on these slides, it might be time to make some changes. You can build in training on these topics as well as some of the things you're already doing. And as noted, as I said, and as we've talked about a couple of times, really important in your training to have the voices of birth parents, young people who've experienced foster care, and foster parents who are committed to reunification be part of your training. I know one system has they do a video on icebreaker meetings that they show at the training, so that people actually get to visually see how foster parents and birth parents are working together on behalf of the child. And I think when you think about training, you want to think about a mix of addressing attitudes, so building understanding and empathy, but also some of those concrete skills such as communication and coaching, because you need both in order to be successful at this role. You need to understand why you're doing what you're doing, but you may also need skills. Not everyone has the skill to coach someone else, even if they're a really good parent already. And as I mentioned already, you definitely want to think about who your trainers are. Do they have these skills themselves? Are they embracing your organizational philosophy about birth family, foster family partnerships? Next, we'll talk about support that foster parents need to partner with birth families. And although it's only one slide, if I could emphasize this slide, make it jump up and down at you, I would. I think ongoing support is critically important. This can be a very challenging role, and it can be a very isolating role for foster parents who don't have a community of support around them. And I certainly can tell you that their neighbors, family members, and friends who are not part of the foster care world will not understand them and will not be supporting your messages in most cases. So you need to have foster parents who have that support from elsewhere. One of the first things is, of course, support from caseworkers committed to reunification. So again, you need to make sure that your caseworkers are receiving this training and information. Those caseworkers need to be on board with the philosophy, and they have to communicate it while also helping foster care parents get over any of the barriers, both logistical and emotional, that they may be dealing with. You may need to have very specific mediation and assistance with birth family relationship dynamics. You might have to be having someone who can have a meeting with birth family and foster family early on, maybe part of that icebreaker meeting, but even down the road, if challenges arise, you may need a professional who can really help with those dynamics. And I particularly emphasize here, this may be an issue for kinship caregivers who have existing birth family dynamics or family relationships that may have shifted and changed and can be harder to overcome. And can never say enough about peer support. Again, you need to make sure your peer supporters have also embraced your philosophy, but you might be offering formal or informal mentors, support groups, parent liaisons, and again, making sure those people have the training and commitment and the skills, so they have been active partners in reunification in their previous experience. Lots of families need therapeutic support related to grief and loss. Specifically, when a child returns home, it may trigger tremendous loss, and you want to support that foster family because it's the right thing to do, but also because they may continue to foster if they feel like, you know what, I can do this. Because again, even if it's the right move, it can be a difficult time for the foster parents and for the other children in their family. And finally, the last two, the welcoming team and timely communication. I think we all know that when we feel included and empowered and part of decision making, it's easier for us to be on board and be part of making something successfully happen. I think that's incredibly important support for foster families. I want to ask another question. Last time I asked about the barriers foster parents experience. Now I'd love to ask about the successes. Can you tell me what your agencies or systems are doing to make it easier for foster family, birth family partnerships to be successful? Okay, so Nicole says requiring icebreaker meetings within a few days of a new placement. I think that is absolutely a great suggestion. Sarah talks about a partnership plan. Again, Ezekiel talks about icebreaker meetings when the case starts. Meeting the birth parents in a neutral setting, Jean says that those again, that's supporting people getting together. Comfort call, that is, I think the virtual version of the icebreaker meeting is really important. Providing therapeutic support to both parties, I think that's great. Family team meetings, being open and honest. Conversations before and after visits, I think that's a really important one. I'm gonna talk a little bit about visits later on, and there's a lot of support needed around visits. So thank you. I think it sounds like you all are doing lots of work. Oh, I want to highlight, Teresa says the use of Zoom has allowed for foster parents and biological parents to have more open communication. And we did just hear this from another system that for some people who are maybe more reluctant for early or in-person visits, it's really lowered the psychological barrier for those. And not only does it let folks meet, but it may actually, like if you're doing the Zoom meeting from the foster family's home, they may actually get to see where their child is, and think about the relief that would be for a birth parent to actually, like, okay, I can picture my child in that family and in that home. And I think that's a critically important thing. So it's one of the things that maybe one of the benefits we can get out of learning, that we can do virtual things differently. Thank you all so much. So now I want to talk about what strategies can workers take on to improve their support for foster families. And I think, again, I've said it already, you've got to encourage positive attitudes and beliefs in foster parents. So you have to think about every interaction you have as an opportunity to reinforce past learning and to help build that organizational culture. So you're helping the way you're telling stories of successful reunification, you're telling stories of parent and foster parent partnerships, you're telling stories about why birth parents may have made decisions they made. So just remembering that as a worker, and you never want to badmouth the birth family, obviously you want to make sure that your conversations with the foster parents are positive. Next, obviously, if we talked about peer support, you want to provide those opportunities. If your system doesn't have formal avenues for peer support, you can create informal programs. If you have a foster parent who's struggling, maybe you can connect them on a phone call or a Zoom meeting with another foster parent who's really great at this. So think about, you can make those connections informally, even if you don't have a program or while you're advocating for such a program. Critically important to support and provide guidance on birth family contact and visitation. We know it is hugely important to the success of reunification, and we also know it can be stressful. We know that kids can come back from visits with difficult behaviors, and sometimes foster parents think that means that the kid shouldn't have a visit, when instead it just means the child is going through very natural emotions of going to see a birth parent and then not being able to stay with them. And so having those conversations with foster parents about visitation and supporting them afterwards, making sure you're there either to prepare them before and talk to them afterwards and debrief them with them, I think it's critically important. And the same is true for transitions. Obviously, transitions are difficult for children and for all parties, and making sure that both foster parents and birth parents are involved in that planning and in getting support after is a really great strategy to take on. And then we'll say it again, we've said a few times, one of the things workers need to do is listen to foster families and provide opportunities for them to share what they've known. We talked about the feedback loops. We want to make sure they're both informal and formal ways. Are you doing regular surveys? Are you doing check-in? Are you letting people know ways to share information? Making sure there's an anonymous way for people to share information, because of course it can be very daunting to raise challenges with an agency that has your license and is making lots of decisions that affect how your relationships go. And more broadly, making sure foster parents are part of decision making. Do you have an advisory team of foster parents? And of course, young people and birth parents. They're really important to be part of all of the decision making. And engaging them in strategic planning, program design. If you're putting out a funding announcement for a new program or developing new policies, do you have foster parents, birth parents, and young people involved in that? And as I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that workers are prepared for the special considerations for kinship caregivers, for the special challenges that they may have. Again, they have great value, and we know that for kids it's really good to be in kinship families, but for the kinship caregivers, some of these issues of partnering with birth parents can be even harder. And then if you're a manager, what are the things you can do to improve support and make this more successful? I think the first is make sure you're consistent messaging in recruitment, response, engagement, and orientation. So review everything you're putting out. Are you emphasizing the importance of reunification? Are you training about the importance of reunification? Make sure that that's the same across all of the aspects of your child welfare work. Don't need to say it probably for the 15th time, but make sure your birth parents and youth is part of your training, and make sure it's skills-based. So, as a manager, review your training. What are the things that are required? What are the things that are optional? And do you need to make changes to that? That's, again, critically important, training all staff on how to communicate about birth parents to, again, make sure that you're changing that organizational culture, as Alicia talked about earlier. We want to make sure that you have peer leaders, that you are listening to them, and that you have avenues for them to participate and support foster parents. And again, I've said it a bunch of times, so I don't need to say more, but making sure you have opportunities for feedback and data to look at what's working and what isn't. And finally, as I close, I just want to have a couple quotes here from a report that the Child Welfare Information Gateway did, which is a great resource. Birth parent saying, creating space for relationship building will become transformational in the life of a parent, also in the life of a child. A house divided is no good for a child. I think that's right there could be a bumper sticker that we put up in our foster care offices. And then a foster parent shared, an amazing supervisor who encourages partnership is effective because of the language she uses. Her message to both the birth and foster parent is, I believe in both of you. And I think these are great things to think about as we move forward with changing our organizational culture and doing more to support birth family, foster family partnerships.
Thanks so much, Mary. That's such important information shared today. So we really appreciate all of our panelists and speakers here today. We'd now like to provide you all with an opportunity to ask any questions you might have of anyone who presented today. So if you want to enter those questions in the questions pod, we will do our best to get to all of them. We did have several come in throughout the presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and ask a few of those. The first question is for the QPI panel. So Carol, I'll let you answer this first, and it would be interesting to get the perspectives of the others on the panel. The question is, what should agency leadership do to support staff in helping foster parents be more active in supporting reunification and partnering with birth parents?
Okay, thank you. So focused on the agency leadership piece of it, one of the things, and I think a couple of our panelists may have even indicated when they were speaking about it, I think Darlene did, but with agency leadership, it's to provide an expectation that there will be partnership, that we will work together to communicate those messages, that it's important, and that it's something that the agency values. I think when that comes from leadership, it makes a big difference. I would say to also include parents in decision making, not just about individual case decisions, but decisions that impact the system of care. So if there's a meeting and decisions are being made about change, make sure that parents are at that table. Include parents on your boards. Include parents in any kind of an environment where you're going to be making decisions that impact the way the system operates. So those are a couple of things that I thought about. Other panelists, would anyone else like to also respond to that one?
Sure, Carol. This is Brandy, and I think that one way that leadership can set the tone is by investing resources in those relationships. So, having opportunities for birth and foster parents to participate together in activities and events, really making sure that there are adequate staff to do icebreakers and comfort calls, and showing through their resource allocation that they value those relationships, offering training for staff, things like that, I think go a long way.
Thanks, Brandy. Anyone else? Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have a question that came in for Manny. The question is there anything specific the foster parent did to help you reunify with your children?
I want to say everything. They were very understanding. They helped. I heard decision making right now. I'm still able to, some way, somehow participate in the school events. Of course, I had to ask the social worker for permission, but I was allowed, doctor's appointments. So just, I think, co-parenting, I want to say, allowing me to co-parent and being, still being part of the life, although they couldn't, be with me, but I was still present, really, eased, made me feel more comfortable and allowed me to work on my stuff while I knew my kids were safe. So yeah, I want to see a lot of what they did really was really important.
Great, thank you. I have a question for Darlene that came in. Are there specific trainings and supports for foster parents that you think are particularly helpful?
Yes, there are. You mean trainings for the foster parent?
Yes.
Okay, yep. So one of the trainings that helped me and my husband so much was the trauma-informed training that came forth, just to talk about the different traumas that we had never even experienced before, and then the triggers to those traumas. In our agency, which is Family Alternatives, they are amazing at all the different trainings that we needed. So just taking that leadership and direction from our agency really, really helped us.
Great, thank you so much. I had a question come in, and I noticed several comments in the questions pod from folks saying that their states used to not previously allow that birth parent, foster parent partnership. And so I think this is a great question that came in, which is for Carol. What barriers has QPI seen in child welfare systems embracing the QPI approach, and what has helped break down those barriers?
Okay, so some of the barriers, I had the pleasure of being at one of the first ever QPI sites when QPI came about. And I know that, our system struggled with some of the changes that we wanted to make, but it just made sense. It fit with a core set of values that we have about families. Being a social worker, it also aligns with those values as well. So some of the barriers, would be policies that are in place that limit the ability of parents to have open, honest, transparent conversations. Sometimes there are barriers around that. Having systems that may respond. We had a campaign called "Don't Say No Until You Know," because we were sometimes so cautious about something terrible happening that we were preventing a sense of normalcy for children, and also some of the natural interactions that parents wanted to have. They felt like maybe they couldn't have those because there were rules or policies in place to prevent that. Some of the barriers might be having staff who, are not aware sometimes of of what it means to be in relationship and why it's important to children, staff who maybe don't have an understanding of child development and the importance of attachment. So those are some of the barriers. And then, Kate, did you ask for some of you had a two-parter, right?
Yep, what helped break down those barriers?
Lots of talking, lots of communicating, inviting everyone to the table. I remember having large meetings where people came together and just started talking about what does it mean to be an excellent parent? What do we think children need? What are children saying to us? So it's really starting to have conversations so that we're able to really understand each other. And from those conversations, then you're able to start to define what it looks like for you to incorporate some of those QPI expectations in the work that you're doing. But it really starts with relationship building is really the key to the QPI approach. It is all about relationships.
Great, thank you so much. We've got lots of questions rolling in. I don't know that I'll be able to get to all of them, but I want to ask a couple more. One question is for Darlene, and it is, what barriers, if any, did you have with the caseworker?
Wow. Well, just staying on the road with being totally transparent. There was a lot of times that some of the caseworkers would not give any information, any background on the child's health issues that they came into our home with, the child's past behaviors that they had. And there was barriers definitely with the caseworkers not wanting us to have any contact or any information shared between the birth parent or either the bio family and the child. So we've definitely experienced that.
Thank you so much for that answer. A question has come in wanting to know how they can learn more about QPI. Carol, I'll let you answer that one.
Okay, that is a great one, and I can answer it. So you can go to, there is a QPI national website. Different states have their own QPI website, but if you just go to QPI, the number 4, kids.org. So that's QPI, the number 4, kids.org. And you can go to that website, you can find all kinds of videos. And one of the things I was about to share also, Kate, is that someone asked about training. So there are trainings that are available on that website that are open and available to anyone. You'll notice one of the things I wanted to point out is there's a video section on that homepage, and there's also a section that talks about conference materials. If you go into the all conference materials section, you'll be able to experience some of the past QPI conference workshops. And probably my favorites in that section, if I want to put a plug in, would be the parent panels and the youth panels. Those two panels, you'll hear the actual voice and experiences of our parents and youth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carol. Now, I am mindful of the time, so I'm going to go ahead and move along, but thank you for asking such great questions, everyone. So I want to highlight just a few resources that we have related to this webinar that you may find helpful. Although these aren't focused on changing agency culture, they do have some insights and suggestions for thinking about strengthening your agency's approach to engaging with families in meaningful and supportive ways. All of these resources, along with our other materials and services, are always free, and you can access them on our website. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Adopt US Kids offers free capacity building services to states, tribes, and territories to assist you in your work to recruit, engage, develop, and support foster, adoptive, and kinship families. Our services can include things such as connecting you to the various resources we have, connecting you to your peers in other states to learn more about how they operate, consultation and coaching services, as well as on-site and virtual trainings for you and your staff, although our team is working only virtually right now. Our family support team also offers a family support peer group for administrators, and we encourage you to stay informed of upcoming webinars by signing up for the Adopt US Kids email list if you haven't already. Lastly, here is my contact information. We are here to support you, so please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions, comments, or requests. And as a final reminder, please complete the evaluation survey that you will receive by email from the Adopt US Kids evaluation team. That will wrap things up. Thank you so much for spending this time with us today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.